Hello and welcome to our discussion on new pathways in New Jersey's climate change education standards. I'm John Mullen. I'm an assistant professor of sustainability education in the departments of educational leadership, administration, and research, and geography, planning, and sustainability at Rowan University. Briefly, my teaching and research centers around questions concerning the relationship between education and sustainability, with a focus on environmental ethics, climate change education, and place-based education. I'm especially interested in the possibilities of and conditions for an ecological philosophy of education. And so I'm delighted you're here with us, and I look forward to discussing this critically important topic with you. Our agenda for today is the following. First, we will discuss some important public opinion data on climate change and climate change education, including some important takeaways and barriers. Then we'll discuss a bit about New Jersey's role in climate change education. And finally, we will discuss some new pathways, including the New Jersey Climate Change Hub, a certificate of undergraduate study I've developed at Rowan in sustainability education and leadership, and a research project my colleague and I are currently seeking funding for. Let's turn our attention to some public opinion data. So throughout this discussion, I will be posing a series of reflection questions for you to consider. I suggest pausing the video for a moment to self-reflect on these a bit before I shed some light on them myself. The first question is this: what is an appropriate basis for trusting science? Take a moment to reflect on this by jotting down some ideas. The first option: should we trust science because the scientists themselves as individuals are trustworthy? Think of the great men of science, for example, people like Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Darwin, Einstein, and hundreds of others. Should science be trusted because individual scientists, like these geniuses, are trustworthy? Is this a sufficient basis? I, along with Naomi Oreskes, would argue that no, this is not a sufficient or appropriate basis for our trust in science. What about option two? Should we trust science because scientists use methods which have produced reliable results? Think here of the various kinds of methods scientists use, like deductive and inductive methods, or models, or simulations, and more. Is this a sufficient basis? Again, I, along with Oreskes, would suggest that no, this is an important basis, but it's not a sufficient basis. What about option three? Should we trust science because of its social character of inquiry, including processes like collective expertise, the vetting of claims, and its sustained engagement with problems over time? Along with Oreskes, I think this is a much more sufficient basis for our trust in science than our options 1 and 2. If you'd like to read more about this, Oreskes' chapter on the perspectives from the history and philosophy of science in this book is especially helpful. Extending this discussion a bit, I'd like for us to also consider the meaning of theory in the context of science. Take another moment to reflect on the various meanings of theory. And here I'll give you a hint. There is 1, a colloquial use of theory; 2, a social use of theory; and 3, a scientific use of theory. See if you can tease these distinctions apart. In a colloquial use of theory, which is different from a social use or a scientific use of theory, we are usually meaning it as a hunch, a guess, an intuition. For example, I have a theory about why that happened. In the social use of theory, or social theory, refers to an explanation or interpretation of how societies function, how power operates, how people interact, etc. And a scientific use of theory refers to a well-established explanation based on a body of evidence that is rigorously tested and widely accepted in the scientific community. Theories abound. Theories of evolution, relativity theory, climate change theory, etc. So these three meanings of theory are important for us when we try to understand the public opinion data on climate change and climate change education. So for each figure I show, I'd also like for you to take a moment to try to understand what is going on in them yourself. But let's do this one together. On the y-axis, you'll see 4 educational categories: less than high school, some college, and a bachelor's degree or higher. On the x-axis, you'll see the percentage of Americans who believe climate change is happening. And if you look at the color legend, you'll see blue indicates a more liberal political ideology, whereas red indicates a more conservative political ideology. Generally, what we're seeing here is the influence of education and political ideology on whether a person agrees or disagrees with the reality of climate change as happening. Here we're seeing the influence of education and political ideology on whether a person agrees or disagrees with the reality of climate change is not only happening, but as human caused. And finally, here we're seeing the influence of education and political ideology on whether a person agrees or disagrees with the reality of climate change is not only happening and human caused, but recognize the scientific consensus on this issue. If I were to move quickly between each slide, you'll see why the question I posed about the appropriate basis for trust in science is important. It seems to be the case that we don't quite have a handle on this issue when looking at some public opinion data, which we'll explore again in a moment. Given the data we just looked at, what percentage would you assign to this question from a national perspective and a state perspective, particularly the state of New Jersey? And also, what is the difference between public opinion and public policy? A helpful way to remember the difference is this: public opinion is about what people want, whereas public policy is about what people get. So what number did you assign for both the nation and New Jersey? According to this poll, 77% of adults somewhat or strongly agree that schools should teach about the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to global warming. Again, a national average of 77% of adults believe that schools should be teaching this. Now, what about New Jersey? Here we see an increase from 77% as the national average to an 83% average across the state of New Jersey, with certain counties across the state having higher percentages than other. And if the data is hard to see in this slide, I'd suggest looking at the interactive platform for this data in the works cited slides at the end of this slide deck. Let's turn our attention to some important takeaways from some national studies on this topic. In 2016, Plutzer and his colleagues published in Science, a premier research magazine, this study entitled "Climate Confusion Among U.S. Teachers. Teachers' Knowledge and Values Can Hinder Climate Education." And in this study, they put forward 2 important takeaways. The first one is, whereas most U.S. science teachers include climate science in their courses, their insufficient grasp of the science may hinder effective teaching. Important takeaway one. Second one is, our data suggests that especially for political or cultural conservatives, simply offering teachers more traditional science education may not lead to better classroom practice. And some key findings from this study also include these. First, teachers might experience overt pressure from parents, community leaders, or school administrators not to teach climate change. Second, teachers may also not be very knowledgeable about a wide range of evidence. And third, many teachers are unaware of the extent of scientific agreement. So Plutzer and his colleagues pose an important question as part of this 2016 study in Science. They say of teachers who teach climate change, 31% report sending explicitly contradictory messages emphasizing both the scientific consensus that recent global warming is due to human activity and that many scientists believe recent increases in temperature are due to natural causes. Why might this be the case? Again, I suggest you pause and reflect on why this might be the case. So this figure on the left is posing two questions. The first question is about the human causes, and the second question is about natural causes. If you agree with both statements, you are among those teachers who emphasize mixed messages. Here, 31%. If you agree with the first statement and disagree with the second statement, you are among those teachers who emphasize the scientific consensus, which is 54%. In the next figure on the right, you'll see that 68% of teachers who agree that global warming is caused mostly by human activities, only about half of them were able to correctly identify the scientific consensus on this issue. Again, these data show the importance of having an appropriate understanding or an appropriate basis or justification of science. Here's another study I want to quickly show. I'd suggest pausing this video to evaluate the data on your own. And the question here being asked is, should climate change be taught in schools? From the same study as the previous slide, here are some reasons teachers don't teach climate change. And here is some data on those teachers who cover climate change in their classrooms from those who don't cover climate change in their classrooms. Let's turn our attention to some important barriers to consider as we move forward. But first, given all the public opinion data that we've discussed in the previous slides, what is one policy recommendation you'd suggest? Again, given all the public data that we just reviewed, what is one policy recommendation you'd suggest? In another study, Plutzer and his colleagues studied the role and function of mixed messages. I'm only going to quickly discuss some of the important takeaways. In part one of this study, they looked at what teachers do in their classrooms. For example, what they teach, how much time they devote to climate change, and how they teach it. In part one, they looked at teachers' educational background and their scientific knowledge. In part three, they looked at the political and cultural forces as well as the personal values that might influence how teachers negotiate socially controversial topics such as climate change. And in part four, they look at some policy implications given their discussions of part 1, 2, and 3. Here are the findings in part 1. And remember that part 1 is what teachers do in their classrooms. Finding 1, climate change is widely taught in public schools, they found. Finding 2, teachers are covering the essential topics. Finding 3, teachers are linking science to action. And finding 4, many students are receiving, despite finding 1, 2, and 3, mixed messages. As well as teachers take many approaches to managing conflict in the classroom. And here are the findings in part 2 about teachers' educational background and scientific knowledge. Finding 6, by their own account, many teachers are more knowledgeable about other science topics. Many teachers' understanding of the greenhouse effect may be shaky. Finding 8, most teachers are unaware of the scientific consensus on the causes of climate change. Finding 9, prior training in climate science is limited. Finding 10, many teachers are interested in professional development in climate science. And finding 11, when asked about their personal acceptance of scientific conclusions, only about 2/3, I believe that says, see human activities as the primary cause of recent global warming. And here are the findings in part 3 about the political and cultural forces, as well as the personal values that might influence how teachers negotiate socially controversial topics, such as climate change. Finding 12, few teachers report explicit pressure from students, parents, or the community. Teachers' awareness of the scientific consensus is linked to their attitudes toward the role of government. And finding 14, most teachers are unaware of the degree of scientific consensus on the causes of recent global warming. And finally, when it comes to policy implications, here are a couple that are especially important for us. I won't read them all, but here are a couple that I think are especially relevant to our discussion today. Implication 1, cumulative, coordinated climate change curricula are needed. Implication number 2, which you can see for yourself. Implication number 3, teachers who are already in classrooms need and want help to remain up to date with the current climate science via effective teaching materials and opportunities for professional development. There are 7 implications, I believe, here, and I'll let you take a look at those yourself. Here's a recent study from Plutzer and his colleagues with 5 key shifts in how middle school science teachers address recent global warming. I've extracted some of the key takeaways here into this body of text that I will let you read on your own. And here's another recent study where the researchers identified the lack of comfort, preparation, and knowledge for teaching environmental issues, as well as the controversial nature and the already crowded curricula teachers are supposed to cover. Again, like the previous studies, I suggest you take a look at these on your own time. Now we're going to turn our attention to the role of New Jersey in all of this. Here are some headlines about the role of New Jersey as the first state in the nation to be explicitly mandating climate change education. Here's a letter from First Lady Tammy Murphy, who was instrumental in this. I want to emphasize a couple of sentences from this letter. First Lady Tammy Murphy writes, "Educating our youth and preparing them for the future is among the most important and challenging work anyone can do. And thanks to you, New Jersey is positioned to continue leading the climate movement. Together," she writes, "we can ensure that our students are equipped with the knowledge and resources to combat the climate crisis and dominate the green economy, no matter what career they choose." Let's turn our attention to New Jersey's Department of Education. Here you can learn about the timeline beginning in June 2020, as well as an important document that was produced in 2022, which we will take a look at in a moment. What I want to strongly emphasize here is how climate change education is being implemented across all grade bands and across multiple content areas. And what is particularly interesting to me is the interdisciplinary approach the Department of Education has taken, where climate change education is not merely siloed in the sciences, but is taught across content areas like health and physical education, social studies, visual and performing arts, and more. This is important because climate change or global warming is not only a scientific issue, but a social, cultural, and ethical one. And it requires a broad interdisciplinary approach to prepare students to understand, respond to, and actively engage with the challenges and solutions in their respective communities and beyond. I'd suggest taking a closer look at these core ideas and performance expectations on your own time, and this is from the Department of Education. Here you can see how the DOE is conceptualizing climate change education in grades K to 12 within the social studies curriculum. Here you can see how the Department of Education is conceptualizing climate change in grades 3 to 5 within the social studies curriculum. And here you can see how the Department of Education is conceptualizing climate change education in grades 6 to 8, again within the social studies curriculum. And finally, you can see how the Department of Education is conceptualizing climate change education in grades 9 to 12, again within the social studies curriculum. I mentioned this a bit earlier when we were looking at the timeline, and I want to emphasize a few key points from this needs report that was produced in 2022. Here we learn about the vision of this report: ensure that all teachers, students, and educational leaders in New Jersey understand climate change and are empowered to develop solutions to climate-related problems. This vision, along with 4 identified needs, including professional learning, curricular resources, community-based climate change education, as well as the Board of Education or support from the Board of Education. And now a need not identified in this needs report is pre-professional education, which is a gap I am trying to meet at Rowan, which we will be discussing in just a moment. A few of the goals associated with this needs report are the following. Regarding professional learning, ensure that all New Jersey public school teachers are prepared to fully integrate climate change education, again across all grade levels and content areas, within 5 years of adoption of the 2020 New Jersey Student Learning Standards. Concerning community education, they write, educate all members of school communities, including families, students, teachers, school staff, administrators, school board members, and community partners on scientifically accurate information regarding climate change to ensure that schools are designed to foster a sustainable future and economic prosperity. Concerning community-focused collaboration, they write this, which you can see in the document that is available online, a community-focused collaboration where schools develop a comprehensive approach to climate change education. Importantly, concerning equity-focused financial support, the needs report states this: using an equity-focused approach to ensure that the neediest schools and districts receive the necessary financial and logistical support for climate change education implementation. Further, the disproportionate effects of climate change seen by communities of color, immigrant communities, and low-income communities must be highlighted. Here, focusing on environmental and climate justice as a major concern for particular communities. Place-based approach, climate center, climate change education and experience in what is happening locally. Place-based approaches that emphasize New Jersey specific effects and local actions in alignment with those specific effects. And lastly, school and teacher autonomy provide multiple entry points to allow school and teacher autonomy to integrate climate change content within each of their unique learning contexts. I want to now turn our attention to a few pathways moving forward given the standards put in place at the state level that we had just discussed. And the first of this is the New Jersey Climate Change Hub. You'll remember the importance of cumulative and coordinated curriculum from the Mixed Messages report that we had previously discussed. Here, New Jersey has partnered with Subject to Climate to create a free platform for teachers, including teacher resources, lesson plans, professional learning opportunities, and more. It may be a bit difficult to see, but last I checked, there were about 3,000 curricular resources available on this platform. Again, freely available on this platform, including many from New Jersey teachers, which you can see here on the right side of the screen. What I appreciate about this, again, is an effort at the cumulative and coordinated curriculum teachers from all sorts of discipline and grade bands can draw on to use and or develop in their own classrooms. And I'm delighted to share that Rowan is also taking a lead in supporting its students for this kind of work with our newly developed Sustainability Education and Leadership Certificate of Undergraduate Study, which I've been working over the past couple of years to develop. Here you can see a bit more about this Certificate of Undergraduate Study and our included list of classes in this certificate program, including sustainability education and introduction, leading sustainable organizations, integrating climate change across contexts, as well as planet in peril, environmental science in the 21st century. And the last pathway I want to mention is a study a colleague and I are currently seeking funding for. And lastly, we want to conduct a large-scale research survey to study how the policy preferences of local communities influence the effectiveness or lack thereof of statewide mandates, which brings us back to the start of our discussion on the role and function of education and public policy on the effective or ineffective implementation strategies of climate change education across the state of New Jersey. In this slide and the following slide, you will find the sources that I've cited throughout this discussion, and many, many thanks for participating in this discussion of new pathways in New Jersey's climate change education standards. If you have any questions or concerns about any of this, please feel free to contact me.